Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Rebecca Stummy. I'm the producer of live events here at LAist, and I'm real happy to see you here this evening for our conversation with Sarah McCammon. And I just want to start out by acknowledging that LAist is operating within the homelands of the Gabrielino Tongva people, and we've made a commitment to recognize Southern California's indigenous past and history of displacement. We have a complete land acknowledgement statement at laist.com/land, and I would like to thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you. And I would encourage you to check that out while you're at laist.com. You can also read all of our wonderful reporting, all of our great stories. Check out our podcast there, laist.com, for anything you need. And before we start, I just want to do a quick audience participation moment. Who is here for the first time at the Crawford? Oh, wow. Welcome. We're so glad you're here. Thanks for coming out. Who listens to us at LAist 89.3 on the radio? Wonderful. Or the app. That's great. Who reads our stories at laist.com? Okay, great. And anyone listen to LAist Studios podcasts? All right, so your homework for next time when you come back to the Crawford, I want you all to check out laist.com and some of our great podcasts. We will have a lot of events coming up soon. Go to laist.com/events. We have so much happening in the next couple of months. So I want to see you all back here and more hands raised for those second two questions. And we just want to thank you so much for your support, for being here tonight. It makes what we do possible, and we love doing what we do. If you feel so inclined, if you're in a position in which you can, go to laist.com/give to help keep supporting real, on-the-ground community journalism, great events like this, all kinds of great things for the community. We need strong journalism going into this election cycle, as you all know, so help us stick around and be here for you for that. We appreciate it. We appreciate you. Couple more things. In case of an emergency, you can leave the way you came, or there are doors behind these curtains over here under the exit sign. And if you would kindly just silence any noise-making devices you have, I would appreciate it. I think that is enough of me. I would like to introduce you to the folks you'll be listening to this evening. Our weekend edition host, Julia Paskin, will be the host tonight, and she'll be speaking to Sarah McCammon. Please give it up.
Good evening.
Hello, hello.
Hello. I heard no sound from the audience. Were you all raising your hands? Please tell me. All right. I was a little afraid I was going to walk out here and there was just going to be empty seats. So thank you. Thank you all so much for being here. Really, really excited as I stall time and open my computer. There we are.
You're just hanging out back there, and then all of a sudden it's time to walk on stage.
Man, wake up your tablet.
Yeah.
But no, sincerely, thank you all so much for being here tonight, especially those that had to make a bit of a drive. We'd like to introduce you once more to our guest, who you likely recognize both her name and her voice from our airwaves here at LAist. Sarah McCammon is a national politics correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast, also the author of a new book, which is why we're all here tonight, The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. Thanks so much for being here, Sarah.
Thank you. And I have to, once again, compliment this set. It is
gorgeous.
So impressive.
Yes. So I'll also add here that we have made time for questions at the end. So if you do have any questions of your own, please hold them until we're done with our chat. So to begin with, this book is a really lovely blend of both extensive reporting and also autobiographical entries. You write not only about your conversations that you've had with people finding a new path outside of the church, but also how you were brought up in an insular community yourself. And you have a passage that kind of helps us understand, maybe enter into your experience growing up that you're going to read for us now.
Yeah, so I chose this reading because I wanted to kind of paint a picture of the world I grew up in. I was born in the early 80s, right at the beginning of the Reagan administration, right as the moral majority was on the ascent. I didn't know any of that or understand any of that at the time. I just knew that I was part of a community that believed we had a sort of a mission from God. And so I want to sort of set that scene. It's difficult to save a world you're taught to fear and are carefully sheltered from. In my early years, my own world revolved around our church, on a sprawling campus, a short drive over the Kansas state line into the suburbs, and the K-12 school I began attending at age 5, which met in classrooms inside red brick buildings of a small fundamentalist Bible church in Kansas City, Missouri. Aside from my father's family, I didn't know anyone who didn't know Jesus. Our mission field was limited, so every sustained interaction with a potential non-believer felt a little guilty, like a shirked obligation, if I stayed silent. One of those rare opportunities presented itself when I was about 8 years old, as my mother correctly determined that I needed to spend several Saturday mornings at what can only be described as a remedial skating lessons. At least once a year, my school rented out a rink for a party where we skated to praise and worship songs. Some of the girls would show up, that's not normal. Some of the girls would show up with their own beautiful skates from home in pink or white leather and seemingly fly around the rink. And I, in my rented brown skates, would cling to the metal bar, scooting a few steps at a time around the circle and often falling. So my mom found a class where an instructor patiently showed us how to maneuver our skates to slow down and speed up and how to use toe stoppers to brake. I didn't know any of the other kids, but I understood that most of them went to public school. There was one girl about my age that I especially liked. She was friendly and chatty and almost as awkward in the rink. We'd stumble through our lessons together, then talk while we unlaced our skates and put on our sneakers to go home. One week, an unwelcome thought entered my mind. What if God wants me to witness to her? My stomach tightened. What if I'm the only person in her life who can tell her? What if she dies without Jesus because of me? I couldn't shake the sense of obligation. The last week of class came, and all I could think about was what to say to her. As we took off our skates and put on our shoes for the last time, I couldn't bring myself to start with the opening line we'd heard in so many sermons. If you died tonight, do you know where you would go? It felt like a little much for Skateland. We picked up our jackets and I followed her outside. We waited by the front door, watching the car line as each parent pulled up. Any moment, my parents would arrive, whisking me home to clean my bedroom before spending a lazy Saturday afternoon playing in the backyard. I'd probably never see her again. Eternity hung in the balance with seconds to spare. My heart pounded. Now, this is your last chance. I said, do you go to church? Yeah, sometimes, she said. Anyway, my dad's here. And that was that. No big sign from God, no literal come to Jesus moment, only me, my skates, and my awkward gesture toward heaven. I wouldn't try to make another one for a long time. And I share that because that was really the world I lived in. You know, we believed that it was our job as evangelicals to evangelize, to share what we knew to be true, what we believed to be true, with the rest of the world. And every interaction with someone who didn't share our belief systems was not just an opportunity, but an obligation in many ways. And as I said, you know, there weren't a lot of people in my life like that, but this little girl was one of them. And I've thought about that moment many times over the years because it's just sort of a window into the way that we saw the world. We were sure that we had it right and that it was our job to sort of share that vision and in many ways impose that vision on the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's one of a number of passages where it's really evident how much responsibility you felt at such a young age, not only to live the truth as you were taught it, but to share it with others. How did that anxiety manifest? There was one passage I remember you talking about your stomach hurting going to bed at night, and I wonder how old you were at that time and how else it showed itself.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that people who grow up deeply religious can probably relate to, and people who don't find just so mystifying. You know, that at such a young age you would have this vision of the world where not only did you have everything figured out, but you had to make sure that everybody figured it out along with you. And for me, and I think for a lot of the other former evangelicals that I met through the course of writing this book, it was deeply anxiety-inducing. when you're a small child, you're really still trying to figure so many things out. You don't know what you don't know, but you know that you're small and the world is big and scary. And the people around you are the people that you trust to help you make sense of it. I mean, I think that's true for all of us to one degree or another, regardless of what tradition we're raised in or no tradition. But I just remember feeling, again, such a sense of responsibility. One of the main characters in my book is really one of the only people I had consistent contact with who was not an evangelical growing up, who was my grandfather, who, as I explained, turned out to be gay, which created a whole several layers of complexity with my conservative evangelical family. And he was the person that most of this concern was focused on. Of course, as I describe it, was focused on people we'd sort of incidentally meet, but really it was mostly about this need to pray for Grandpa, pray that he'll get saved, pray that he'll stop being gay, And it didn't, spoiler alert, it didn't work. So, yeah.
Yeah. I want to talk more about your grandfather in a moment because that was that the evolution of that relationship is definitely one of the most moving parts of the book for me personally. But I wonder if you see things differently, if there's a different lens now. There are a number of people that you talked about in the book who have undergone some form of therapy, who view some of these feelings that they had as a child, even some of the anxiety, that responsibility, through a trauma lens. Not all of the memories, of course, but some, and how that has changed for some people over time.
Yeah, I think, one of the challenging things to think about or get my head around about all of this has been that sort of trauma piece of it, because I've always sort of felt that some of this did produce, deep and lasting trauma. And, that's a word that gets thrown around a lot. But, I do remember lying awake in bed, worrying my grandpa was going to go to hell. I interviewed my brother for this book, and he had very similar anxieties. And then lots of other people I talked to for the book, including, a couple people who described just this real palpable fear as children of the rapture, which is, if you're familiar with conservative Protestant eschatology, to use a big $1 million word or whatever, $10 word, end times theology, was this idea that basically, Christians who believed in Jesus at the end of the world would be sort of taken up into heaven and just disappear. And there are lots of different versions of this theology, and not every evangelical believes in it, and some evangelicals disagree with each other. But we were told, very literally, that this would happen and that the end of the world was imminent. And so it could happen in our lifetimes. It could happen at any time, that we would just be sort of taken up. And for the adults in my life, that was an exciting and wonderful thing, because it meant being united with God. But for a lot of us, I think, who children, have very vivid imaginations, it was very scary. And so I talked to several people who had, whether it was the theology about hell or the rapture or various other things, a lot of experiences that produced a tremendous amount of fear in a young mind and body that didn't really have resources for coping with it. At the same time, there's a lot of literature out there that suggests that religion can be very positive for mental health, that it people with religious traditions often report higher levels of satisfaction and happiness and positive mental health outcomes. And so, how do you sort of square those things? And in talking with several researchers and also therapists who are working in this kind of developing field of religious trauma, it seems to essentially come down to the idea that religion, this is like so many human things, right? Religion can be good or bad. It's kind of how you do it and how it's applied. So, but I think this is something that a lot of therapists don't really understand, because there is such one therapist told me there's sort of a bias toward thinking that religion is going to be all good and all positive. And again, it is for many people. But there can be pieces of it that are quite the opposite.
Let's go back to your grandfather. Tell us a little bit about the man that he was and how your relationship with him was one of the factors that propelled you away from the church.
Yeah, so he was born in 1924, and when he was in his 80s, I sat down with him for a recorded conversation, because I work in audio, and I'm so glad I did that. But he talked to me about, growing up he was born around the time that Harvard, which wound up being where he went to college and medical school, had expelled their gay faculty, and I think students as well, but certainly faculty. He grew up at a time when, being gay, the impressions he saw in media and in culture were of people who were sort of marginalized, rejected, not healthy members of society. I mean, there were so many stereotypes that he grew up around, and he told me that he knew early on that there was something different about him, but he didn't know what it was, and the perceptions he would see of what it meant to be gay didn't feel like they were aligned with who he was. He had no sort of normal, healthy role model in that time of what it meant to be a gay man. But he, after my grandmother passed away in the 80s, he came out, he started dating men, he wound up having a partner for many, many years until the end of both of their lives, essentially. But all of this was happening, again, at a time, my grandmother passed away in 1984. He came out within a couple of years. So this was at a time when, again, my parents were, deeply enmeshed in the evangelical religious movement, but also the political movement. And this just set up this incredible clash of sort of cultures and visions of the world. My grandfather was this man of science and I think was interested in thinking about religion, but was not a religious person himself. And my parents had had this really moving for them conversion experience of conversion to evangelical Christianity in both of their teens. And so by the time I come on the scene, I've got these deeply conservative Christian parents, I've got this gay grandfather, and it just meant that I was getting really mixed messages throughout my childhood about really about the truth of the world and how to make sense of the world. So, in my younger years, I did have a lot of concern about him. I prayed every night at dinner. We would pray for his soul. I would lie in bed and pray for him, pray that he would get saved. But as I got older and started to, think a little bit for myself and have more experiences outside of what a lot of us have called the evangelical bubble, I came to sort of, first, I think, feel that there was no good reason to treat him differently or to see him differently. And I also came to really want a relationship with him. He was the only grandparent I had for most of my life. The others had passed away either before I was born or when I was very young. And he was somebody that I really admired. I mean, he was a very accomplished person. Just someone who introduced me to art and literature and music, and who was always sort of this presence in the background in my life, but this real role model of learning and education and achievement. And so I'm very grateful that, as I got older, I was able to spend really the last couple of decades until he passed away, getting to know him and having a relationship with him that had been really difficult when I was growing up. Mm. But he was a big reason. I mean, I think his existence created a foil for me for everything I was being told by my church and my Christian school about the world and about how people, were supposed to be.
Yeah. You write in the book, it wasn't just one moment, and for many other people, it's not a singular switch that flips. It's an ongoing process. Sometimes these thoughts are kind of running in the background. You don't have a lot of people you can talk to about that. Eventually, you did get to a point where you realized that the church was not for you. The Evangelical church specifically was not for you. When you came to that realization, was there a period of mourning?
There were many moments, like you say, there were many things that I struggled with, and there was a lot of, I think, grief. It wasn't like there was one moment that I said, I'm done with this. It was more of just kind of a slow journey of unpacking things, becoming, rethinking what I thought about my grandfather, both his sexuality and his lack of religion. And I think by the time I got to college, I went to an evangelical college, I was pretty well on that journey, although I didn't talk about it with a lot of my friends because I knew what most people believed. Mm-hmm. Certainly by the time I got out of college, I had come to fully accept him for who he was. But there were other moments I talk about in the book of just sort of encountering people of different belief systems, of realizing that, for example, what I was being taught in my Christian school curriculum about science was just inaccurate and deeply out of step with, and I'm talking about creation science in this case, was deeply out of step with what the vast majority of people who studied biology understood to be true about the world. And so I tried, to sort of make sense of these things and accommodate them. I think initially I would resist accommodating them and then kind of come to a point of such cognitive dissonance that I had to or wanted to, in the case of my grandfather. I really came to a point where I wanted to accept him. And so by the time I got out of Christian college, I was exploring different traditions. I was reading a lot about church history, trying to understand how the church had come to be, how the Bible had come to be, trying to just sort of understand better how the sausage was made in a way. And during that time, I was exploring different kinds of churches and then kind of drifting away from church. And so again, there wasn't one moment where it was all over, like a breakup. It was more like a slow unwinding. And I don't want to say that it's even over. I mean, I still have a real interest in spirituality and religion, and I still believe in God. But the way that I think about it has changed so much. But I think the grief, to try to answer your question a little more directly, the grief comes in, in those encounters with people that I was once close to, some of whom I think have struggled to accept the way that I've changed. And also in many ways in a loss of identity. This is something that I really try to explain to people sort of outside of this world. It's that it's not just about a set of beliefs. It's also about an identity and a subculture, which again is something I think probably anybody who's grown up in a religious tradition will be able to understand on some level. And it can feel like when your beliefs change, your identity changes, or people in your life think that your identity is changing and like you're rejecting that community. And that piece of it, for not only for myself, but for so many others that I talked to for this book, I think has been one of the most challenging parts.
You have another passage that you've prepared that will help us understand a little bit more, I think, how you came to write this book and connect with other folks that identify with the label of Exvangelical.
Yeah, I often say this book is a product of kind of the unexpected and sometimes uncomfortable intersection of my personal background and my professional work. I had been certainly out of the evangelical world for a good 10 years when I was recruited by NPR to cover the 2016 campaign. I was assigned to the Republican primary and spent a lot of time with a variety of different Republican candidates before ultimately, of course, covering the presumptive nominee and then the nominee, Donald Trump. And so for me and for so many other journalists covering that campaign, because of the importance of the evangelical vote within the Republican Party, everybody was doing a lot of stories about whether or not evangelicals would accept and support Donald Trump, someone who seemed so antithetical to so many things the movement said it stood for. And I was thinking about my own, adolescence when Bill Clinton was president. I was 17 in 1998 when the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal blew up, and I remembered very well, and I write about this, remembered very well the reaction of the evangelical movement to his character flaws. And so I was fascinated to watch that play out. I was covering it as a journalist and of course, thinking about my own history. So this passage is a little bit about that. And I should say that the setup to this passage describes another experience I'd had in church watching an Easter pageant in which the crowd is yelling at Jesus as he's carrying the cross, up to Calvary. So that's what you'll hear a line that refers back to that. By the end of 2016, I had become accustomed to being yelled at by angry crowds of people. Assigned to cover the Donald Trump campaign as a correspondent for NPR, it felt almost routine to those of us in the press pen to huddle over our laptops, rushing to meet deadlines while people passed by to shout insults at us. However large our egos may be in the national media, I don't intend to compare myself to Jesus here. But there were frightening moments in those angry crowds. It also wasn't unusual to engage in warm, friendly conversations with rally-goers, often as they were arriving and Elton John's Tiny Dancer blared over the loudspeaker. They might have made a joke about the liberal media at my expense, but many were equally happy to talk and tell me why they felt so seen and inspired by this real estate developer from New York City. And then the music amped up, Trump took the stage, and the atmosphere would shift. The crowd took on its own energy as Trump pointed toward the risers and cameras at the back of the room, complaining about those disgusting reporters who were the worst people. This quickly became a part of his shtick, a highlight of every rally. Trump would whip the audience into an excited frenzy as they turned to point at us and laugh. In my reporting for NPR, I often described this moment as very much like a rock concert, in which Trump's attacks on the press functioned like one of his greatest hits that the audience would demand to hear before they could leave satisfied. You could feel the catharsis in the air as these crowds poured out their frustrations with the economy, with immigrants, with the Washington establishment that they felt disdained them, and directed them at us. Men in red MAGA hats shook their fists and tried to stare us down. I'll always remember one grandmotherly-looking woman in Colorado who leaned in toward the reporter's pen, pointing and shouting, "You're disgusting." We were, it seemed, representatives of the hated establishment on their turf, and we were more than a sufficient proxy. But I wasn't part of that, or I hadn't felt that I was. I had moved to Washington part-time to cover this campaign and spent months reporting on the Republican Party's evangelical base, leaving behind a spouse and 2 young children in Georgia, feeling nervous and out of my element after spending most of my life and career in the Midwest and South. These people in the crowds were, in reality, my people, white, largely Midwestern or Southern Christians. They looked, sounded, and believed a lot like people in the evangelical community where I'd first learned about God and about politics. When I interviewed them, they'd often bring up their Christian beliefs and their fears about the direction in which they felt the country was going. They saw Trump as someone who could get the country back on track. I'd been away from the church of my childhood for many years, but I watched with curiosity and sometimes confusion as members of the movement and its leaders first wrestled with and then wholeheartedly embraced Trump in numbers large enough to secure the Republican nomination and ultimately the presidency. And it was also during that time that I first heard the word Exvangelical. I was writing a story right before the election about the release of the Access Hollywood video, and the famous one where Trump talks about grabbing women in their private area. And I was talking to some evangelical women and writing about the fact that some high-profile evangelical women had been speaking out with concern about the continued alliance between evangelicalism and Trump. You know, I think a lot of people thought that moment would be the moment that finally broke it, that was just too much, and it wasn't. And so I was talking to some of these women, and one of them essentially said, you know, some of us feel like we're calling ourselves ex-evangelicals now. We don't want to use the word evangelical because it's become associated with this political movement that doesn't feel like it speaks to who we are. So I started paying attention to that word, looking around online, and kind of discovered this whole world of social media discourse about ex-evangelicalism, a lot of which was catalyzed by that moment. Donald Trump sort of putting a spotlight on the evangelical movement and forcing a lot of, I think, self-reflection about what it was and what it meant going forward. But people were sharing a lot of other experiences, a lot of which I related to. And so that was kind of the genesis of the book.
And you report that it is a considerable movement of folks who are leaving the white evangelical church. Can you quantify that for us? How many?
You know, I was talking to someone.
I'm sorry, compared to especially the time that you were growing up.
Yeah. So I look at lots of data, and I want to say, first of all, that the decline of church attendance and of Christian affiliation is across the board in the U.S. We're seeing it in evangelicalism, but also in Catholicism and mainline Protestantism. It had been most precipitous in mainline Protestantism for a long time. In fact, when I was growing up, we'd hear, that mainline Protestantism was shrinking, but we were growing, and that that started to level off about 20 years ago. So when I was, according to data from the Public Religion Research Institute, which I think does some of the best reporting on religion and politics, and also Pew and a couple of other data sources, putting it all together with the help of Robbie Jones, who was the CEO of the the founder of the Public Religion Research Institute. His best guess is that about close to 1 in 4 Americans were white evangelicals in the early 90s when I was in middle school. That number fluctuated a little bit, but held fairly steady until about the mid-2000s, and then just dropped precipitously. So the shift happened a little later for evangelicalism than Protestantism, mainline Protestantism. But according to the newest data, some of which came out after the book came out, it looks like some of that has leveled off a little bit, at least, and I don't want to get too into the weeds and bore you with numbers here, but weirdly enough, the disaffiliation from evangelicalism has leveled off, so people no longer saying that they're evangelical. That's kind of stabilized. But church attendance is still dropping. So there's a lot happening. The big picture story is that this country is becoming much more secular. And so for white evangelicalism, it's dropped from like 23% to about 14% today in the last 20 years or so. And that's significant because what's really unique about evangelicalism is the sort of lockstep political alignment with the Republican Party. If you look at other religious groups of similar size, so Catholicism, similar size, mainline Protestantism a little smaller, but kind of in shooting distance, those groups are much more politically mixed, whereas white evangelicals are overwhelmingly Republican, and that's increasingly the case, it looks like. There are a lot of reasons for that we can talk about if you want, but the increasing secularization of the country, including the decline of the evangelical church, raises a lot of questions about where those voters end up going.
Why is it important to differentiate between the white evangelical church and evangelicalism in general?
Yeah. Mostly because of, I think, voting habits, which reflect different priorities and values. So if you look at, there are lots of different kinds of evangelicals, but if you look at Black Christians and white Christians, and specifically people who hold similar theological beliefs, Black evangelicals and white evangelicals, they vote really, really differently. Black Christians of all types overwhelmingly vote for Democrats. White evangelicals overwhelmingly vote Republican, as I mentioned. And there's a chapter in the book where I talked to several Black Christians who had spent time in white evangelical spaces, either in seminaries or in churches and other ministries, partly as a result of efforts that evangelical churches have made in the last 30 or 40 years to try to become more integrated. There was a lot of attention in the 90s when I was a teenager. I would hear my pastor talking about it, to a lot of concern about the fact that the church was so segregated. But of course, that segregation has arisen out of distinct histories, different priorities. The Southern Baptist Convention, which is still, it's shrinking rapidly, but still the largest evangelical denomination in the country, was founded because of segregation. And it was founded by, its founders were supporters of slavery, and the church split over that. Now, that's something that the SBC has apologized for and repudiated, and I want to be clear about that. But those, that is part of the history. And I think you see that those different lived experiences, priorities, values, play out in the way that people with similar theological beliefs but different racial backgrounds vote. And what some of the Black Christians I interviewed for the book talked about was a feeling that particularly around 2016, it became harder and harder to be in churches with people who were voting against, what they saw as their interests, their best interests.
And is this what led to the Leave Loud movement?
That's the chapter called Leave Loud, which was a sort of a hashtag, another sort of online movement, kind of a related idea to Exvangelicalism by, again, Black evangelicals who were saying we need to leave churches that are not prioritizing racial justice, and we need to leave loudly and let them know why we're leaving. Mm-hmm. So that's why, my editor and I talked about whether or not we should put white in the title, but I think as a journalist, it's really important to be precise about what we're talking about. And too often when we talk about evangelicals, we erase everybody but white evangelicals. And so when we're talking about white evangelicals, I think it's important to say who we're talking about.
A word comes up a lot in the book, and you mentioned it, I think, at least once tonight already, deconstruction. What does that mean for someone, and does that meaning change over time?
So this is a word that I also had not encountered until the last several years. But it basically is used to describe the experience of rethinking one's religious beliefs and interrogating them and doing what I had, in retrospect, done in probably throughout my life, but especially in my early 20s as I was sort of getting out of my evangelical college, starting my own life, my own family, my own career, and trying to figure out, who I wanted to be in the world. Things like reading about history, re-examining beliefs about sexuality, science, whatever the case may be. I think the word deconstruction comes originally from the work of Jacques Derrida, who's a philosopher and literary critic. I don't get into that here. That's not what I do. But the way it's used in these online spaces like Facebook groups and TikTok channels and Twitter and so forth is to describe this experience that a lot of people are having as they move out of, in some cases, evangelical spaces, but I've also seen deconstruction applied to just more broadly rethinking a religious tradition. And what's been so fascinating for me is to see that, in this age of social media and the internet, there is a language and a vocabulary for something that I think a lot of people have experienced forever, but didn't have words for. And so part of the reason I wrote the book is that I was finding one thing sort of leads to another on the internet, and I was finding all of these spaces and kind of communal spaces to talk about this experience, which can be so isolating when it's happening alone. When you're rethinking your whole belief system, your whole, like I said, culture, it can be very scary, very isolating. But social media, I think, has sort of created a new vocabulary and a place for people to find each other and talk about these things. And I should say podcasts, too. There are lots of podcasts that explore these kinds of themes.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more about how the internet has helped people find community, because it seems that is one of the most impactful things that happens as you lose, as you've described, your sense of identity and community. Are people able to redefine that through social media and other forums?
Yeah, so when I heard the word Exvangelical when I was doing that story that I mentioned, I just started looking around on Facebook, Twitter, and so forth, and like I said, now there are, I think, billions of TikTok impressions for the word Exvangelical, and I don't spend too much time on TikTok because I'm too old, but there's a whole robust conversation going on over there, which I didn't even know about when I pitched the book. But yes, I mean, I think people, some of it's just sort of watching other people talk about, how they're making sense of, say, evangelical purity culture, rules around sex and dating, how they're dealing with, I've seen in Facebook groups a lot of conversations about how people deal with family members who hold different beliefs. And then I've seen there are sort of like subgroups and smaller groups that pop up around particular themes. There's one I'm part of on Facebook that focuses on parenting and how to, when you've been taught, to raise your children in a very specific way that's sort of prescribed by the church and certain evangelical ministries and so forth. A lot of people find themselves trying to figure out, how to think about parenting through a different lens. And so I think that's been it's been really powerful for a lot of people. And also I mentioned podcasts a second ago, but there's a whole range of podcasts out there about parenting, about just understanding, like biblical criticism, things that frankly, I wouldn't have been taught in school because I think for a lot of people it would seem too threatening. But we know information is at our fingertips now, and I think a lot of people are taking advantage of that and finding information and also finding community.
I'm going to ask you to put your reporter hat on for a moment. Many of us in this newsroom, and we're just local, are already preparing and starting to cover the presidential election, and I'm sure a lot piling up on your plate. I wonder, after the reporting you did specifically for this book, if your reporting on the next election or the upcoming election has changed at all, or if there's anything in particular you're looking at in terms of the political influence of the white evangelical church.
Yeah, I took a little hiatus from full-time political reporting and covered abortion rights for several years, and I'm still doing some of that. I'll be paying a lot of attention to that issue in this election because it's going to be on the ballot in several states, it looks like, and it'll be a big focus for particularly for Democrats, who I think see a lot of opportunity with that issue to reach their base voters. And that, of course, is an issue that has religion wrapped all around it. And I always try to pay attention to the religious undertones of some of these debates because, sometimes people don't spell out the religious piece of it, but it's right there under the surface if you look for it and ask the right questions. When it comes to white evangelicals more broadly, I'm actually really curious about non-white evangelicals because, the Republican Party has made strides in the last couple of elections with trying to reach out to non-white voters. We talk a lot about white Christian nationalism, and while polling from groups like PRI indicate that white evangelicals are the group that appears to be most susceptible to sort of Christian nationalist ideas like America is a Christian country, should be a Christian country, the appeal isn't limited to white evangelicals. And, there is a lot of, I think, cross-pollination that happens in some of these churches. And I'm very curious about, efforts to reach some of the more, maybe swing voters that maybe white mainline Protestant religious voters who have traditionally voted for Democrats, but are sort of reachable. And also I'm really curious again about non-white religious voters because I think in some ways that's a swing vote and it's a group that is less attention is paid to, but we probably should pay attention in an increasingly diverse country.
Could you tell us a little more about, I'm seeing a couple more questions and then we're going to turn it over to you guys. This dissonance you mentioned a few moments ago between that Access Hollywood tape, a couple of other things that the former president has said that are not in alignment with Christian values, but that there has been, I don't think you used the term mental gymnastics, that some...
I don't know if I did, but it's a good one.
Maybe I heard you do it in an interview somewhere, but that you found leadership within the evangelical church finding ways to treat that behavior differently than they had Bill Clinton. How have they made sense of that? Mm-hmm. What is the logic there for those that are not privy to that? And how many people have left just for that reason?
I don't know how many have left just for that reason. I mean, anecdotally, a lot of people I talked to told me that the last 8 years or so have been a turning point for them. Either it's shifted the way they think about their churches or just their willingness to sort of say that they don't feel like this movement represents them. But when it comes to how people who are still strongly identified with evangelicalism resolve that, I think, conflict, there have been a number of ways. I think early on we saw prominent evangelical leaders, and I document this a little bit in the book, saying things like, we need a president, not a pastor. Trump is imperfect, but so are we all. We're all sinners. We all fall. We all, can be redeemed. God uses sinful people. I think that you still hear that kind of rhetoric from evangelical leaders today. The thing that I always sort of try to highlight is the fact that I don't think that most evangelicals think of Donald Trump as one of them. They don't think he's a deeply devout person. They know he's not. That's not what this is about. It's about alignment with an ideological project. It's about very effective messaging by Trump to evangelicals, to themes that they've been hearing for decades many times from their pastors and movement leaders, and which I document in the book as well, this idea that America is and should be a Christian nation and that it's been moving away from that Christian identity. It's in decline. The problems in our country are because of that movement away from Christianity. So, when Trump got online on Truth Social and hawked that "God Bless the USA" Bible a few weeks ago. I mean, this is
the $60 Bible.
The $60 Bible with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights right there with the Old and New Testament. It's right in line with that messaging. He said Christianity is under siege. We're going to bring Christianity back, and we're going to need the Bible to do that. I'm not directly quoting, but pretty close. Mm-hmm. And that kind of messaging resonates with many evangelicals who do see their numbers declining, their cultural power declining, and but I think see someone like Trump as as someone who will sort of carry out their vision for the world. And why wouldn't they? I mean, he delivered the first time with the overturning of Roe v. Wade.
Shifting gears just a little bit as we start to wind down. I think for a lot of us, there was a lot that's very relatable in the book, even for folks of different backgrounds. We were talking backstage about this a little bit, that, you know, anybody that steps away from the person that they were raised to be, that creates some sort of conflict with your family, for some of us more than others. And you interviewed a number of people who handle that in different ways, and you've been faced with this in your own way, and you're very respectful about maintaining your family's privacy, so please only share whatever, you can maintain that privacy, of course. But how, any advice for anybody listening now to approach those interpersonal relationships where they've become difficult because of this difference?
Yeah, I think, in talking with a number of people for the book who've had to sort of resolve whether it was a religious difference or, I talked to several people who had come out as gay in families where that was not accepted. It seems like, and this is just a theme I see in a lot of these evangelical spaces too, is the idea that you really have to be thoughtful about boundaries and setting clear boundaries about what you will and won't talk about. It's something I've certainly had to learn with some members of my family, and it took a long time to learn it. But I think there's a lot of power in saying, I love you, and so I don't want to talk about this because it will be harmful to our relationship. And that can be really painful because it does create distance. One of my friends, Jeff Chu, who's a writer, recently ordained as a minister, talked about attending his seminary graduation from Princeton, which first of all is an institution that his father didn't accept as a legitimate Christian seminary, and then having to have his husband Tristan sit on the opposite side of the room from his mom and dad because his parents, wanted to come to his seminary graduation that they didn't fully support, but they wanted to be there for him, but they couldn't accept being near his husband. And, that is a compromise that a lot of people would not be willing to make. And I think that those choices are so individual. I'm not sure I'd be able to make that compromise. I might say, don't come then, But for Jeff, that was what was necessary. And in conversation with his husband, and he said he talked, I think, really beautifully about how his husband was sort of the most, I think he said, Christ-like person in this whole story because of his patience and graciousness toward his parents. Again, not saying that everyone should handle it that way, but that's how they chose to handle it, and that's what worked enough for them. And I think those choices are, again, they're so individual and they're so difficult. In my family, it looks very different with each relationship. There's some members of my family I'm very aligned with, and others that there are just a lot of things we don't talk about. And I think it requires some decisions about what are those boundaries that you can accept and that you can't accept, and what are the trade-offs you're willing to make or able to make.
Highly personal decisions. It
Yeah.
seems.
Yeah.
Well, we'd love to open up the conversation to questions from this lovely audience here. We have two of our staff members with microphones on either end. Do we have our mics ready? We do. Wonderful. So we do ask if you could, because, we want to be respectful of Sarah's time in the evening, if you could please, and I know it's hard, we have a lot to say, if you could please limit your questions to questions. And not to comments. I know it's really hard. And we'll all have a chance to briefly chat with Sarah when she signs books later. But if you could please try to keep your questions as short as possible, we can get to as many. That would be great. We're going to start on this side of the room over here, and then we'll move to the gentleman over here. I saw your hand up very quickly, and then we'll keep going back and forth. And we ask that you stand if you're comfortable to ask your question.
I have to start with a quick comment. I love the book. I'm only about a third of the way through, but
it gets better.
I bought it because there is a schism in my family. I'm going to get really emotional. I am a recovering Catholic, and my sisters and I wanted to have a book club to try to bring up some of these things that we thought it might be helpful. And aside from some very key words that I heard you say, grace and patience, How do you deal with what's happening in my family is, just schism. And how do you deal with the hypocrisy? Can you find honest relationships with those people that you say you just won't go there and talk about it? You leave politics at the door.
And not just politics, but sometimes theology and even decisions and choices you've made in your life. I mean, it can be big. The short two things. First of all, thank you, and I'm glad the book's resonating with you. And I know I've heard from others of other traditions that it resonates, and that means a lot to me. I think these experiences are just kind of human experiences. And I wish I had an answer. I mean, it's very difficult. It's painful to feel like there are people that you love, that you would love to share big swaths of your life with, that you just can't, or you can't fully connect around. I feel that. I experience that. I think it's cool that you and your sisters have a book club. I hope that's a good thing for all of you. But I guess the one thing I will say is that for me, there's been an ebb and flow, and sometimes certain relationships are more difficult than other times, and I'm not sure what to attribute that to. Maybe it's just the passage of time. Things might come to a head, and then you take a minute, take a breather. But maybe if I ever have a second career as a therapist, I will have better advice.
Hello, Sarah.
Hi.
Didn't quite get interviewed by you, but I did manage to make it to your talk. So Charles Templeton, the prominent Canadian evangelist, went through with this process that we now call deconstruction way back in the mid-20th century. And it was seen as isolated and novel then. But nowadays, it seems like, deconstructing Christian celebrities and musicians and pastors has almost become like a cliche. So why do you think that exvangelicalism, if that's what we're calling it, has become so much more prominent and visible now than it was in the past?
I do think a lot of it is the internet and social media. I mean, if you left a church in the 90s, there was really nowhere to go. I mean, there were a few books about this experience, but it wasn't like there was a support group or really a place to find community. And I think that that's really changed now that, one, people can find each other on social media, and two, that anybody can start a podcast. Somebody sent one to me the other day, and it's like by two people who only use their first names, but the name of the podcast is I Hate James Dobson, who, if you know, some of you know who he is. And I'm not commenting on that except to say that there is a niche for everything, right? And anybody can have a podcast about anything. And so I think that has created spaces for all sorts of conversations. The other thing I'll say about it, someone recently said to me that they I think it was somebody who interviewed me for their podcast. It's all a blur now. But somebody was saying that they think that in some ways what's happening right now is almost like another religious reformation. The people who started, Martin Luther and others who started the Reformation that led to the creation of Protestantism, and evangelicalism is part of that, were seen as heretics in their day, and people who rethink or deconstruct their faith are always seen as heretics. And, I think we should all apply critical thinking to all of it. I'm not endorsing everything that's out there in any way, shape, or form. But my point is, I think that this process is a very human process, and but I think it looks really different now because of the internet.
Yes, in the third row on the aisle. Do you mind standing if you can?
Yeah. Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Sarah. My question is, with everything going on right now with this upcoming election, and it seems that the Federalist Society, Harlan Crow, all that big money behind politics now, in the guy with the backdrop of religion, and the Supreme Court. Obviously, we all heard what happened today and the questions and everything, but what a lot of people don't understand, and I'm sure everybody here understands, the importance of the Supreme Court and the presidency. And that presidents change, they term out, but the Supreme Court does not. So I see a lot of money being put into their agenda to make the Supreme Court stay as it is for a long, long time. And if that's the case, how do you see where our country goes from here?
I can't make predictions about where the country goes, but I think that is something that a lot of Republican activists have understood for a very long time and have worked very hard to get conservative justices on the Supreme Court. It's something that I think rank and file Republican voters got the message as well. When I was covering the 2016 campaign, and I would talk to people, including a lot of evangelicals who had reservations about Trump as a person and as a potential president, the thing I would hear over and over again was, but the Supreme Court. So it's been a motivating issue that Republicans have really successfully organized around. For whatever reason, I don't think Democrats have organized around that in the same way. Maybe that will change.
Second row over here.
Hi, Sarah. I grew up evangelical as well in Nebraska, Assemblies of God. And so I'm curious if you mentioned this in your book, which I haven't read yet, but I'm very excited to. Could you speak about your purity culture journey at all and how that's affected you?
I didn't ask you about it, but you write about it.
Yeah, there is a whole chapter on that. And yeah, I mean, purity culture was not a new idea, but in some ways I think it was almost a throwback in the 80s and 90s, especially to maybe to the 50s or to, I mean, a mindset that was dominant for most of the country prior to the sexual revolution. But you had, writers like Elizabeth Elliot and Josh McDowell and later Joshua Harris, who became kind of the most prominent writer from that movement. He had this book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye in 1997, which advocated this very rigid approach to dating and relationships, really no physical contact at all. And even, I mean, Josh Harris even took it farther to this idea that even dating in the traditional sense was a bad idea, that you should instead sort of pray for someone to come into your life and then court them and pursue marriage with them. And this was a really influential idea. It became pervasive across much of evangelicalism. Most kids who grew up in evangelical youth groups around that time read those books, at least some of them, took purity pledges, I had a purity ring, which I talk about. Funny story, I had two because the first one broke. The stone fell out of it. I don't know. But it was this very rigid approach to sexuality. And I think, one of the things I tried to reflect on in the book is the fact that from the mindset of I think, the parents who were telling their kids to approach dating and relationships this way, they were trying to protect them. They were trying to protect us from heartbreak, from, broken relationships. But, there's side effects to overprotecting, right? And what I think a lot of, especially millennials like myself, I'm an old millennial, but just barely, but a lot of us found that, what was promised didn't exactly deliver. That many people who I interviewed, and there have been other books written just about purity culture, and I felt like I needed to do a chapter on it, but other books have been written that go into it in more depth. I think a lot of people found that they didn't get to know themselves. They were so afraid of sinning that it got in the way of kind of being human, and that has resulted in a lot of heartbreak for a lot of people. So I actually interviewed Josh Harris for the writer I mentioned for a story for NPR a few years ago when he was publicly rethinking some of these teachings because he was hearing from adults who had said, either I never dated because I waited for the perfect person and now I'm alone, or I didn't do anything before I got married and I'm not compatible with my partner, or I tried to fit into this mold and I realized I'm not straight, or whatever the case may be. He actually had his publisher pull the book, but one of the things he said to me in one of those interviews is that there's no perfect way to do relationships. It's just messy. It's just hard sometimes, and I think that is very true. But I hope you enjoy the book.
Gentleman right there.
Hello, Sarah. I always try to raise my hand quickly because I always think about my question too long and never ask it, so forgive me if this is not well formulated. But as I think about your journey from being within and identifying fully with the evangelical community to where you are now, I wonder if there are any key pieces that you think this is without. I suspect that there are a lot of pieces without it going exactly the way it did. You wouldn't be where you are and see the world the way that you do. But what I heard in your story that you've spoken tonight, your grandfather, that personal connection with someone who is different and distinct from this community, and the dissonance that created between what the community and the teaching of the community said about him, about how God related to him, about his value, and your personal experience, those two things didn't jive, and that seems to have planted a seed that grew. Mm-hmm. I heard also that you went away to school. You had other relationships. Obviously, you work for NPR, and you've gone into journalism now, so I suspect that the people around you have tolerance for you to grow, to break down the boxes of those things. My question is, are there things about your journey that you think this was the key? And given how personal those are, and how much less it seems that people of different backgrounds are able to talk to one another now, the exposure we get to someone from different, do you feel that there's hope for other people to escape from a system of thought in which there are many things conspiring to try and keep them there?
I guess I'll say a couple of things about that. First of all, my objective is not to deconvert anybody, but I do hope that the book will open up space for conversations about this experience or similar experiences. I think one of the things that's most painful, that has been for me and for other ex-evangelicals I've talked to, is this idea that you sometimes hear from people, within your church or family or whatever, but this idea that deconstructing or leaving the church or rethinking your beliefs in some way is a product of rebellion and anger and a desire to, sin or even to be hurtful. And I think that, this experience is hard enough for people if it means really kind of rethinking your own identity in a lot of big ways. And it's really painful to hear that from when it's really just not true. And one of I think the most meaningful things to me is I've heard from several, either a couple times in person at book events and also just messages on social media, I've heard from several parents of adult children who raised their kids in this kind of environment, I think because they were trying to do their best, and have come to kind of rethink at least some parts of it and realize that their kids are rethinking parts of it. And a couple people have said it's helped them to understand what their kids have gone through. It's helped them sort of process their experience. And that, that's really meaningful to me, because I really hope that, again, it will just open up dialogue. And I think it can be so hard for people who hold really rigid beliefs and believe that everything is at stake in having the correct beliefs, to accept that there are people that don't see things that way. And, I guess that's another thing. I hope I try to maintain empathy for members of my family, because it's really scary to think that, your daughter's going to hell or something. But I think there's a lot of fear that gets wrapped around that, and that can get in the way of those kinds of conversations and connections. And so, if this helps people to have those discussions, I think the other thing I'll say is that I think stories are really powerful, and that's why I wanted to share not just mine, but a lot of other people's stories, and that's probably why I'm a journalist, because I think stories are really, really important. I'm not, I didn't go into journalism to persuade people of anything, but I do hope that stories, both in this book and the stories I tell on the radio, will help people of all kinds of perspectives expand their experience and their minds, because, we all just have this one, as far as we know, one life, one body, one story, and it's really important in a pluralistic democratic society to listen to each other's stories and try to cultivate some empathy about them.
Yes, 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 we like that. Thank you, Sarah. All the way in the back, we've got, there we go.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much. But also, this is a question for you, but also probably any fundamentalist, evangelical in the room. Have you ever met someone else from your background and gone, oh my God, let me trauma dump with you and share with you because only you know my experience and let's talk about it? Because what I find being a second generational Pentecostal fundamentalist kid who had a mother who was a missionary in jungles of Africa and Japan is that when you have that generational trauma dump on you from time and time again, that when you find a soul, do you ever just look at someone and say, can I talk to you for 5, 10, or the rest of our lives? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, it's part of why I wrote the book, because I've had that experience my whole adult life. Like, you'll be at a party and, drinking beer out of Solo cups in your 20s and run across that. I mean, and I spent my 20s in the Midwest, so I ran across lots of evangelicals. And I didn't, like, one of the things I say in the book is I did not realize, like, it was so insular that I didn't realize how big the movement was. And so it's like you start running into people everywhere who have similar backgrounds or, grew up in Catholicism, and I'm not denigrating Catholicism or any tradition, but, grew up in the church, have struggled with it in some way and like have things to unpack. And so that unpacking is like, yes, it's like an instant trauma bond. And so, I would be in the corner at the party with the Solo cup, and you start, all of a sudden you're like, you go from small talk to like really deep talk really fast. I'm really bad at small talk, probably because when you're raised evangelical, like people ask you all the time, it's like, hi, how's the weather? And how's your walk with the Lord? And so I don't know how to do the in between. I'm really bad at it, which maybe is good for journalism because it's like you can walk into someone's house and just immediately talk about the really serious thing that they're dealing with. But yeah, I guess the short answer to that is I 100% know what you're talking about.
That feels like a really good place to leave the evening. And I'm so sorry for those that we didn't get to answer your questions. I want to thank you all so much for being here. A couple of quick things. Sarah is kind enough to hang around and sign books. So I'm going to steal her off the stage, and you're going to have to find her outside in the parking lot where we've got a book signing table set up. For those that, if you don't have your own copy, Flint Ridge Bookstore is here. Thank you guys for being here. You can purchase a copy for Sarah to sign. If you have not read the book, I highly recommend it. I learned a lot from it as a human and also as a reporter, someone who occasionally has to cover politics. So highly recommend it. It might be a good gift to give to someone else.
Wow, thank you. I should take you everywhere.
Yeah.
Just hype in my book for me.
Also, but just a big fan. Just how great is it that we have Sarah McCammon here? Just really wonderful.
Well, thanks. I want to say thanks for supporting your local station, because as somebody who came through the station system,
That's right.
very, very, very important.
Yeah, we don't have NPR unless we can grow through the ranks at your local station. So
We don't
please-
have NPR without stations. I mean, so
Thank you. Appreciate that. Also, so I think the bar is probably still open if you want to grab a quick drink as you wait in line. And then also, we have, there should be a QR code up somewhere. There it is. Please give us your feedback. If you really enjoyed tonight, if there was anything in particular that you'd like to see duplicated, please let us know. We'd like to meet you where you're at. Or if you're like, wow, this was really bad, please do tell us. We'd like to hear that feedback too. It helps us be better. Like that Julia, she was really great until she did that one weird thing.
never invite Sarah McCammon again.
Yeah, just let us know how you feel. No, we do hope that you come back very soon, Sarah. Hopefully for the next book. Hopefully that you will continue a prolific writing career. And also a thank you to our in-person team who made this beautiful set and have been helping you all throughout the evening. Once again, thank you all for being here, and thank you to Sarah McCammon for being our guest. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.